Hey there friends, and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three certified Pro Tools experts and avid instructors discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in the official Avid Support Forum on Facebook. I'm your host Dave Phillips, audio engineer and lecturer based in the UK, and today we're tackling a question from Roberto, who asks: Dear Pro Tools family, asking for your help. When I duplicate MIDI clips, the first note often disappears. Maybe you have a tip for me. Thank you. Well, we have a few tips. So what we're talking about today is basically how MIDI clips work. Before I start, I want to give a shout out to our Patreon supporters who generously support us each month. Many thanks to Mike, Greg and Matthew and Don. And if you guys would like to support our work at Pro Tools Answers, we'd appreciate it very much. You can head over to patreon.com/Pro Tools Answers and select a manageable Patreon tier that suits you. Anything you can do to support our work is greatly appreciated, and if you wanted to make a one-time donation to the channel, you can also do that over at protoolsanswers.com, where you can also subscribe and get a lovely email every week from Andy. Now, joining me as ever from Tonkraftwerk in Austria, the omnipresent Anders Motz. Anders? Andy, have you seen Anders?
Yeah, I was wondering. You said there's three people on the show, and I'm right over there, or there.
Well, and I'm over here. Well,
there's nobody.
I also said Pro Tools experts, but two of you guys are master instructors. I'm just a lowly expert.
Oh, dear Lord.
But there's just two of us.
There's just two of us today.
There's just two of us. Yep.
Anders has Pro Tools Answers exited. How would you Brexit Pro Tools Answers?
Texit?
Texit?
Protexit?
No.
Protexit. So it's just us today. Say hello to the ever-present Andy Hagerman.
Hello. How you doing?
That was so New York of you.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about MIDI clips, and let's start off with just by talking about the differences between audio MIDI, because obviously these are the main two performances that we're going to be capturing in any Pro Tools session, isn't it? So let's just take a look at what a piece of audio is. So the audio recorded here, I've got a bass track, and then I've got some MIDI captured by a Rhodes piano. When we're cutting up audio, this is very, very easy. Let's just make a separation. Oh no, I can't do that on the grid because I haven't yet set up my function keys. So if we wanted to make a cut of this individual bass note here, I'm just going to make a slice, and we can move that around. Very nice, very easy. It doesn't matter where we make the slice. The note is still going to come with us. So let's do that. Let's move that over there, and then we can obviously just stretch out the note there to be able to bring the transient in. So that's nice and easy, right? We all understand that. MIDI, however, is ever so slightly different. So if I make a slice here of these two notes, of this chord rather, and then move that around. What happened there? Is this because I'm running on Monterey, Andy, or is everything broken?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you need to trash your preferences. That'll fix
it. You skipped right to the end. That's rule 10. Andy, what's going on?
So the one of the things that is an advantage of extreme old age is you remember what MIDI was back when it wasn't as graphic as it was now. The problem with the modern DAW is that MIDI looks like it sustains, but it actually, what a MIDI note is a series and a family, if you will, of MIDI messages. And so I'll share my screen here real quickly. All All right, and eventually, there you are. You're looking at Pro Tools. Now, you'll see here I've got 3 different tracks. Let's take a look at the top one first. So I've got these 4 blue notes. So, by the way, this is very similar to the specific example that the person who posted the question had. Now, they look like they have duration, and it looks like you should be able to cut out the middle of it, just like Dave did with audio. But really, what you have is this. This is really what MIDI is doing. So the first note, the first note here, so I'll go ahead and I'll just sort of select this note here, bump, and again, I'll bring back my event list. This note has a lot of different MIDI messages that work together. So it has a start time, it has a pitch, it has a velocity, and it has an end time. So that end time is right here. The length is the point at which that MIDI note is instructed to finish, right? So if you remove the start, which is arguably the most important single part of that message, if you don't include that start in what you're copying and pasting, that note will completely not react, right? So what Dave did before is he selected the latter parts of notes without selecting the beginnings of them. So the only time that a MIDI note will ever be copied or pasted or moved or dragged or whatever is when you capture all of this data, especially the beginning of the note, right?
Yep.
So let me take. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's what we refer to as note on data.
That's correct. And by the way, if this is this explains one of the things that can happen. Rarely, but it happens. Is that when you stop playback and your MIDI notes will just hang on forever, right? And that's because your synths or whatever have gotten a MIDI note on information, but because of whatever you've done, they never did get a MIDI off. And in that case, what you do, you go into Event and you go to All MIDI Notes Off, which is also called Panic. Okay, which is your panic button. You hit that, and basically that will keep your system from just going on infinitely with the note. So let's take a look real quickly here. So I'm going to move this over here just so we don't lose it. And I'm going to put myself in grid mode. I'm going to get my selected tool, and we'll go over here, and I'm going to select my bar. And you can see here that all 4 of these notes are selected. And so if I duplicate this, Bob's your uncle, everything's fine. Why is it fine? Because I selected all of the note beginnings. Now, I'm going to select the first note only. So I'm going to just select this little dude here. Come on. The second time I've done that. I'm going to select the first note only. I've got a nudge value of 1 sample, and I'm going to nudge it earlier by 1 sample. And you can't see the difference, right? So it looks like nothing has changed, right? So now, and I'll go back to what I had before. I'm going to put myself back in grid. I'm going to select this, the whole bar, and the first note the beginning of the first note is 1 sample, not even a tick. It's 1 sample. MIDI data in Pro Tools is sample accurate. And now, if I hit duplicate, then you're not going to get that first note, which is exactly what happened to the person who posed the question. I guarantee you what happened was he didn't capture the beginning of that note.
Andy, let's look at that again, but switch it over to Clips View, because I think a lot of us will continue to do this kind of editing in Clips View.
Certainly.
We can see what happens.
Right. So here's my clip, right? And I'll go ahead and separate it here.
And it looks like it's been selected, right?
Looks looks completely fine. And I'm going to do this, and it's gone. Why? Because that note is just 1 tick. 1 sample before the beginning of the bar line, and my grid is on the bar, right? And this is not a bug. It's just the way that MIDI works and has worked since its inception in 1983. Okay, so if without that note on message, nothing else makes sense, and so that data is then discarded. It's kind of the same thing here. So on this second one down, I'll put myself into slip mode now, and I want to cut some notes. Now watch what happens. At this point, nothing is selected until I break the beginning of the note, and then the entire last note is selected. Not just a portion of it, the whole thing. And if I hit delete, then that whole thing is gone. So now let's go over here. I'm going to make a selected area here, and I'll select this. Notice that the first note is not selected at all, okay? And that the reason for that is because, like you saw on the top track, the beginning of the note is outside of the selected area. Notice that the end of this third note is selected because the all or nothing equation when it comes to selecting MIDI is the start of the note. And if I hit delete now, then 2 notes will be discarded. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. So
Now,
so what can we do then if we to kind of get around this?
So one of the things that you could do, obviously, is bounce it to MIDI. And in MIDI, you can cut off the ends of notes and the beginning notes, and Bob's your uncle. But there's there's an interesting little shortcut that you can, well, not a shortcut, but a workaround that you can do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to separate these notes, and separate notes is the same as separate clips. So if I hit the B key, bump, those notes are all separated at my selected area. Now, the only problem is that all of these notes now are selected because the beginnings of these notes are selected, also technically speaking the beginnings of these others. So if I hit delete, all the notes would be gone. So what I'm going to do is I'll make another selection, and then I could do a number of things. One of the things that I could do is restore last selection, which is going to go right back here, and at this point it's only going to have these guys. And at this point I could click this. And we're done. So I basically separated the notes at the selection, and then all the notes that were within that selected area, I deleted that, and that has a similar reaction to cutting out MIDI.
So did you use Command X? Did you cut those to the clipboard?
Geez, I don't remember. It does you can delete or you can cut X. Let me.
But once you've got that selection, all of the regular stuff, it becomes valid, doesn't it? So you can copy, you
absolutely.
can delete, you can cut, you can duplicate.
You can do all those things. So let's instead of using the revert to save restore last selection, let's do this. Let's say I lose my selection. What's the easy way to get rid of these guys? Well, it's easy. Just make a selection here, and notice it's so easy. You don't have to be particularly careful about it. All you need to do is make sure that you capture the note starts of the notes that were in the selection, and then I'm hitting the delete key, but you could copy paste it, you could duplicate it, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, indeed. But there's an intrinsic problem with that, I think, in that if you're cutting notes and trimming notes at bar lines, possibly for the purposes of making duplications or copies and keeping everything on the line, you're essentially changing the performance, aren't you?
Oh, you definitely.
So, because if I could wrestle the screen back from you,
sure. Oh, you're absolutely doing that, and MIDI doesn't stop on a dime either. Some notes will have reverb tails and their decays and all that stuff. So it's not exactly the same as MIDI by a long shot, but no. It's similar in its result.
Yeah, indeed. Because if you are capturing actual performances. And humans don't play absolutely perfectly in time. Some of us more than others, and some of us less than others. This Rhodes performance here is a live. It was actually a quantized performance, but it wasn't quantized 100%. So you've got.
God bless you, Dave Phillips, for not quantizing 100%.
Yeah. So all of these lines don't land exactly on the grid. So the moment that I want to make changes to this and sort of doing duplications and things, it's just not going to do it. So if we were using Andy's workflow, we'd essentially be creating new start points. So we'd kind of be quantizing, wouldn't we, if we were doing that? Because you'd be trimming and creating new breakpoints, which would make the note start at the beginning of your selection, which would be there.
Yes, which is what you don't want. And in this case, a combination of slip mode and relative grid mode becomes a real good friend.
That's the one. So let me just set this up briefly. So if I just do a duplication of this and then let me just bring that back out again, it reveals the note, right? Because all that we're doing is we're just extending out the handle of the container to actually show us the MIDI data, the note-on data that lives in there. Because in exactly the same way as audio clips, these clips here are just containers for the MIDI data, and you can trim the left and right. You can trim the MIDI data in the same way that you can do with audio, but it still exists there. Right, so that is one way of getting around it. It's just you might have to do it for a number of MIDI clips, or if you use the mirrored MIDI editing. I needed the tooltip to remind me, Andy, it's too early in the morning. Then whatever you do to one clip, make a copy of one clip, whatever you do to that one should happen to all of the others, right?
By name. They have to be the same name. So
course.
if you break that linkage, then that doesn't happen. But yeah,
right.
I would say that's super useful for things like drums and ostinatos and things that repeat verbatim.
Yeah. So let's flip over to relative grid mode. I'm going to make a selection slightly differently. Let's flip over to slip mode. I'm going to go into tab to transient, and I'm going to tab to my MIDI notes, and I'm going to Command E to make my separation there, and then slip back into grid mode. I really need to sort out my function keys.
Right.
And I'll make my selection to the end of bar 3, although this is slightly trickier because I'm moving between bar 5 and bar 4. So that doesn't make it any easier. So I've got my selection. It's just off of the grid. It's just ahead of the grid. But if we switch over to relative grid mode, this is where relative grid mode can become our friend. If I'll option drag it. If I duplicate, it's going to snap it to the end of the selection.
If you duplicate it, yeah.
That's what makes it tricky.
Yeah.
If option drag, I can make those selections, keeping my selection of my MIDI notes. Maybe it's a little longer,
Yeah, one of the things that can make it shorter is, and I think you're with a new computer and you're working out your modifier keys, so it's probably not going to work. But one of the things that's really useful in a workflow like this, because you're switching between grids and slip mode to do what you're doing, is the command key on a Mac or the control key on a Windows computer. When you hold that down, even if you're in grid mode, your selector tool and your grabber tool, all your tools, will act like they're in slip. So what I'll do very, very often is I'll keep myself in relative grid mode. I'll hold down command and then make my selection as if it was in slip, release the command key, and then my cuts and pastes and drags and all that stuff goes right back to acting like it's in relative grid. So I can probably show it to you, assuming, of course, that my modifiers work.
I think it's worth pointing out that there's lots of things in any DAW that is kind of designed to speed up your work, and one of the reasons that we go through our training and experience also helps as well is being able to do lots of things very quickly. There are some things that I'm not going to say you can't do this quickly. The workflow that I was just showing with moving things over using relative grid mode, it may take maybe 30 seconds longer if you were going to be copying one thing over an entire grid, keeping that relative grid location. It might take a little bit of extra time just to possibly keep the all the kind of manage the clips possibly afterwards. It's not that much extra time though, is it?
Oh, hey, no. It's definitely, it's the best we've ever had it. By the way, while I'm at it, let me just show a couple things, because what I want to do is I want to heal these separations. So I'm going to use the pencil tool, which is what I use a lot for my writing. I'm going to go ahead and write some new notes and just slip them around here. Great, fantastic. If I want to cut a note while I'm in the pencil tool, which I do an awful lot, I'm going to use Shift Control, and it turns into like a little butter knife, and I can click wherever I want to click, and it's going to separate that. Now, in the case of the selected area, it also acts like a Band-Aid. It's an adorable little icon, and so I can click over here and wherever I click, it heals the separation. Kind of like heel separation works for clips, but it also works for here. And again, to do that, I'm holding down Shift Control on a Mac and Shift Start on a Windows computer. So what I'm going to do to show you this workflow, I'm going to put myself in relative grid. Okay. Now, if I'm in relative grid, and I'll use the Smart tool. If I'm in relative, come on. I'll use the. I'll put myself in Clips View. Come on. There we go. Now, at this point, it's going to be impossible for me to really, click close to these notes. So it's not really going to be ideal for me until I hold the Command key. And now with the Command key, notice that I'm still in relative grid mode. Okay, so right now I'm in relative grid mode. I'm making my selection however I want to. Now at this point, if I was in notes view, I could, I could just move my notes. Here, what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and hit the B key, and then, really, to be honest, I can do whatever what you were doing. So let's go ahead and make Option drag, and here it's going to make sure that you're keeping the same distance because you're in relative grid mode. But I never left relative grid mode. I just used that command modifier to make that selection. It just takes a little bit of edge off that workflow, just a tiny bit. But it's when we're working with MIDI, we're doing this hundreds and hundreds of times, and so any little thing that you can do to save just fractions of time, that really adds up.
Yeah, but there's also something else that we can do as well. Let me wrestle the control back from you. We may even be able to make this even simpler. So let's work on this little bit here, because this is just a little bit easier to work with. Let's switch over to normal grid mode, and let's make a bar selection, but I'm going to make it one resolution line shorter.
Sure.
So we can duplicate, and the same thing is still going to happen, isn't it? We're just making a slightly different musical selection to keep things, duplicate things, and keep things in exactly the right place.
Sure. And if you sometimes you don't have the space to do that, which is why which is why it's always good to keep that command key in there. But yeah, if you've got the space, then there's a lot of ways to skin that cat.
Yeah, indeed. So that's talking about MIDI though. But I'd say this is talking about MIDI. It's all about MIDI. That's MIDI note on. That's just one piece of data out of an entire collection of performance options that MIDI is capturing. What else is going on in this clip?
Well, so I'll wrestle control right back. Like I said, if you don't capture the beginning of a MIDI note, then the rest of it kind of doesn't make any sense. So the end of a duration, velocity, the end of a note doesn't really make a lot of sense on its own, which is why note data works the way that it does. But if you take a look at this bottom track, you're going to see on the MIDI tree, it looks like I have an empty clip, but I don't. Okay, so if I take a look over here, and I'm just before I reveal, I'm going to go ahead and make a selection. Come on, there we go. I'm going to break it over here, and I'm going to come on. Oh, let's go back here, and I'll drag this over here. Now, there's no note data in here. Okay, what there is continuous controller data, and the continuous controller data also would include your pitch bend, MIDI volume, anything like that. So if I take a look at this, you're going to see a little bit of a different kind of a view. Instead of a suite of data that make a note on, velocity, note off, sometimes note off velocity, things like that, really continuous controller data is relatively simpler. So continuous controller data is simply a specific value for that parameter, in this case, modulation wheel. So you don't have to, so whatever you capture, right? So if you capture the breakpoint, it's not like you have to capture a beginning and an end. It really, that breakpoint is its own beginning and end. And you'll see here that at this point, my pitch bend goes up, and then I made a bit of a cut. I'll undo what I did, right? And that's what I had before. So I could do something like this. I could cut this and paste this over here, and there's no beginning and end really to consider, right? Now, by the way, all MIDI clips can have note data and MIDI continuous controller data, often does, right? And MIDI continuous controller data on its own will make MIDI clips. So if I go back here to clips, you'll see here what looks like empty clips, but they're not. It just happens to have data that isn't note data.
Yeah. So, and once again, it's worth reiterating what you're cutting out there is the breakpoints. So you've got to, when you're cutting your notes, when you're cutting your notes up, you've really got to consider what breakpoints you're cutting as well, because you may end up cutting off some pitch wheel stuff, some expression stuff, and that will just make the note react in a slightly different way to how it was potentially performed.
It could. I know a lot of folks that will record their continuous controller data on separate tracks, so different tracks that are going out the same MIDI output.
Yep.
I, from time to time, will do it myself. It's not my normal workflow, but it's something that I will do from time to time. That gives you a little bit more autonomy over, what's turned on and what's turned off, and you can, mute the clips and suspend that continuous controller data without muting the notes.
MIDI tracks are good for that. I've started doing something similar with, we were talking over the last couple of weeks about key switches for brass tracks. I've been recording the key switches on separate MIDI tracks and then just routing those MIDI tracks to the instrument. So I've got two tracks running one instrument. It's a really, I really like it. It's a really nice workflow.
I do that. That I do all the time. The reason why is that you've got your chords, for example, that are in a certain range. Your key switches are by design way out of the playable range of that instrument because it's not supposed. It controls things like articulation and it's not a note per se, but it's a modification of the note data. So, I find that when I've got my performance and my key switches on the same track, I'm scrolling up and down all the time to see my articulations. But if you have it on two different tracks, then you've just got long articulation notes that are in a low register, completely visible all the time. And then on another track, I've got my note data. They're both going out the same output and the same channel, so they both control the same instruments. It's completely not a problem. You do, however, have to make sure that they don't inadvertently get out of sync, which is why I'll often create a clip group of them, but which you can ungroup and regroup and do all that.
Yeah, I found it was really nice for making. It was specifically brass section that I was working on, so trumpet, sax, and trombone. But I found that I could make the key switch track once, and then copy it over to the trombone and the trumpet track, because all the articulations are going to be the same. Switching. It was
sometimes,
it was switching the instrument between your grace notes and your staccato stuff, but each of those instruments were changing at the same time to keep those performances the same. So just doing it once on the key switch track and then copying it over to or duplicating it rather 2 more times and then applying those to the other tracks made it really quite easy work.
That does depend on the library that you use, how consistent they are with their key switches. It also, by the way, depends on the tessitura, the playing range of the instruments. So typically with violins, because their playing range is so high, the key switch notes are below it.
Yeah.
Right. But with things like tuba, the key switches are usually above it, because the playing range is so low. So the key switches will be above. Yeah. So that will often work if the library and the manufacturer is thinking, and also if you're using the same virtual instruments from the same manufacturer.
Yes.
Once you mix and match it all, that all goes away. But you're right, to a certain, to a high extent, you can often copy those, and one thing you for sure can do is copy them over and then shift the notes while keeping the times of the articulation changes the same.
Yeah, the transposition function can be your friend there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So have we covered as much as we could do to potentially answer this question, Andy?
I hope we answered it. I think we did, and a little bit more.
Awesome stuff. Well, I hope that was.
It's such a pleasure to talk to you. What has made this episode so much more fun than other episodes in the past? I mean,
I don't know.
What's changed?
We don't.
What's different?
We don't usually talk about MIDI. We don't usually talk about contact.
That's true.
Key switches, maybe. It's a bit earlier in the morning. I've not.
Else is different?
I've only had one coffee. This is.
What else has changed? Anders, we missed you. Come back soon. the whole Brexit thing that Dave said, he didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. Right?
Yeah, this today is entirely my fault. My week has been upended with sessions and lectures and stuff, and rehearsals actually. And this was the only day we could do it. And as this is his family day, I believe. I think he's doing school runs and things.
And good on him for priorities.
Yeah. So who knows what interesting stuff Anders might bring to the table, or that we might be missing.
He brings the clever, that's for sure.
He certainly does. And Anders, if we've missed anything, make sure you comment.
Yeah. Comment down here.
You don't need to tell us. You just comment. So if you've enjoyed our episode, hit like on the video, hit subscribe if you fancy following more of our stuff. This is what we just do every week. It's just interesting Pro Tools tips, some high-level stuff, some mid-range stuff, some beginner-based stuff. But no matter which kind of tier you personally sit in, there's always something that you're going to learn. There's always little gaps in knowledge, no matter how long we've been using the software, right?
And speaking of MIDI, let me just at the end throw something out. I'm thinking about creating a track template for MPE, multi-polyphony expression users. Because what we have in Pro Tools now, we do have the Falcon, the UVI Falcon, which does have some MPE presets. And Pro Tools doesn't exactly support MP3 without a little bit of workaround. That workaround I know how to do, and if somebody's using a Rolly keyboard or a Sensel or any other MPE keyboard, type it down there in the comments, and I'll create a track template, and I'll share that with the subscribers of the website.
Yeah, indeed. And the eagle-eared amongst us will notice that you might have just said MP3, and Pro Tools doesn't support MP3.
Oh, I'm sorry.
MPE. I'm sure
MPE.
People will be saying we don't need to support MP3 anymore. The devil's codec, it should just go away.
The devil's codec. No. If I misspoke, I apologize. MPE.
It was a nice one. I just thought I'd jump in there and mention it.
No. Keep me honest on it.
It was a good one. So yeah, if you're liking what we're doing, hit subscribe, hit the bell icon so you get notified of the video releases. Head over to protoolsanswers.com. You can subscribe over there, and you can make some one-time donations, as I mentioned as well. If you want to support the channel wholesale, you can head over to patreon.com/protoolsanswers. There are some nice gifts for the patrons as well. You can also get one of our Pro Tools Answers shirts, the proper hockey jerseys from protoolsanswers.com. That page should be live by now. And
yes.
All it leaves me to say is thank you very much to Anders. And thank you to Andy.
Oh, you betcha.
My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers, and we're out.